Welcome back to 80 Proof Gaming. I've been wanting to do this video for a really long time, but the NDA has prevented it. I still can't use videos, but at least I can put up screenshots while I talk about the game. Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn is fun. I can't really overstress that I have enjoyed the beta test entirely. There are a lot of different features of the game I'd like to talk about. I think I'm going to start with storyline just because that's people's primary concern and primary interest about Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn. One of the strengths of it being a Final Fantasy title is that they're very experienced at making an RPG storyline. There are a lot of fantastic, interesting characters. A great example of this is in the Pugilist questline. There's a character named Hammond Goldfist or something of that nature. Master Hammond, the Goldfist or something. And he teaches you from when you join the guild to be a pugilist until later on. And what happens is you get in this big fight and he sends you out and he's like, haha, here I am, so you guys had better surrender. And one of the people who used to be in the guild as a pugilist is on the bad guy's side, and he says, haha, you're all fools, why would we surrender to this guy? And he sends out a squirrel, and the almighty Hammond Goldfist pulls out his weapons and he tries to punch the squirrel and he misses, and the squirrel does this backflip and kicks him in the face and he falls on his ass, and it's hilarious that you've been like serving this guy and he's been a fraud the whole time, and he's got like people following him and worshiping him. And I say worship, that's a little bit too strong a term, but he's like a celebrity. And there's just all that sort of interesting depth of character is something that I really like about Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn. But there's also the sort of cool RPG style storyline where you're fighting the primals, who are they're basically elemental embodiments, and they are the gods of the Beastmen tribes, which are pretty much any race that's sentient that isn't on your side of things. They're bad guys. They're like goblins and orcs, and there's an overarching plot of this evil faction watching over the things that you're doing while you're doing things. You occasionally see them in cutscenes sort of watching you or whatever, and they are the Garland Empire, and they have the Magi tech, and they have gun blades. If you're familiar with Final Fantasy VIII, that might be of interest to you. I've seen several gun blades in cutscenes, sort of excited about it. I don't think I got any good screenshots, but if I did, I'll be sure to put it up during this section. And the storyline doesn't hold up the game by itself. I mean, no game can fall back on storyline alone. I say that, but there's Dear Esther as an example of a game that tried. But this is an MMORPG, so there's got to be some MMOing and RPGing. So let's talk about the combat system. It is really quick. You're hitting abilities very frequently. However, that doesn't really mean that it's deep, necessarily. It's when you're fighting by yourself, I noticed that I was just using the same things in order over and over again, and that isn't necessarily fun. I know that this is a thing that MMORPGs do most of the time, since World of Warcraft, since time immemorial. There's only so much that they can do with tab targeting and using abilities to make it fun. They have put down some enemies have, I'm using this attack, there's a red circle on the ground, you better get out of that red circle before the attack goes off or you'll take a ton of damage. And generally you want to get out of those red circles or you won't be doing so well. And I'll talk about raids as well, because it sort of leads into this quite well, but I'll talk about those in a minute. Right now, the skills. I wanted to mention that the skills themselves aren't particularly interesting to me. I mean, granted, I only got to level 23 and on one combat class. So I didn't get far enough to really see if they introduce more complicated skills. But in a one-on-one environment, I was a pugilist, and I have attacks that would do bonus damage if I attacked from behind or from the side, depending on the skill. And that would be really interesting, except that I've got no way to get behind or to the side of any of the people I'm fighting. They don't offer me stealth things like a rogue. They don't offer me a way to stun them and then walk around behind. There's only use the ability to hit them in the face with. There are a few abilities that sort of mix it up a little bit. An example of this is later on I got an ability that it would give me a buff, and that buff would make it so that I dealt more damage. And there was another ability that would give me a buff that made it so that I attacked more quickly. And one of those abilities I could have 2 stacks of, and the other one I could only have 1 stack of. So you wanted to keep track of which one was active, which one, when you had the buff up or not, so that you wouldn't be using the one that does less damage but gives you a buff when you already had the buff. And you don't want to use the one that deals more damage but doesn't give you a buff if that buff isn't up. So it gave you one more thing to think about, but all it came down to was I used 1, 2, 3, then 1, 2, 4, then 1, 2, 3. It's just a tiny variation in the same spell order. There are also buffs that last for about a minute, and they have a cooldown of 1 to 3 minutes. So you want to use them during fights at the right times, but you definitely want to be using them in most fights, unless you really felt like saving your defensive abilities for a time when you were in a lot of trouble. And one thing that further complicates the issue is that you can bring in skills and spells from other classes that you've leveled. There is a limit to how many that you can bring with you, but you can bring, up at first, I believe it's 2 when you first unlock other classes, and then 3 and 4. I'm pretty sure I only had 4 when I finished playing, but I didn't check just before I was done, so I only leveled one class to level 23 and another class to level like 4 or something like that, just because I wanted the defensive ability from Marauder. And so it leads to a system that might have depth, but it's really tough to say from the onset. And the solo content is not very fun for me. I think that to get the full experience from the game, you need to have at least 2 people that you play. I mean, not at least 2 people that you play with, but you and another person to really feel the flexibility of the combat system. That said, I should get on to talking about raids. There are dungeons in this game. They are called dungeons. They are not called raids. There are dungeons. There are guild hests, or I think they renamed them to behests or something of that nature. And there is another type of multiplayer content it's another category, but it's mostly for storyline type areas. Now, when you get to a certain level in the quest chain, they require you to go and do 3 dungeons in a row before you can move on. Do I approve of this? Yes, actually, I think it's a fantastic idea. I think that this game's focus is on the fun of playing with your friends and possibly of playing with complete strangers, but you want to be playing with other people. That's where the system has all of its strengths. And if you don't show that to people, if you don't make people go out and see that, a lot of people are going to write the game off before they ever see the part that's the most fun. They're just going to do their thing that they think that they're interested in. They'll try and power through the quest line because other MMORPGs are a race to endgame. You want to get to endgame and then you want to go and do dungeons that are at endgame. And they just want to do whatever they feel like will level them the fastest for that, which in other games is hopping from quest to quest to quest to quest. And they'll miss out. They won't understand what makes this game good. And so by requiring them to do a few dungeons early on, it makes it so that they are sort of submerged in where the fun is. And then once they've seen that, if it's still not their thing, then they should be playing something else. So raids are interesting. I was sort of in the early beta phases, which I cannot confirm or deny that I was even in. There was only one dungeon available, and that dungeon, I saw it as being fun, but there were some things I worried about as well. And in the most recent beta phase, going back to that same dungeon, the things that worried me have been fixed. Although they removed the optional boss, which bothers me. And so they have a duty finder system, which is every server is interconnected for the duty finder system. And I just keep saying the word duty. You queue yourself up, and it'll be for whatever class you are on when you start the queue. And then you can wander off. And you have to have been to the dungeon before, and you have to be along far enough in the quest line that they wanted you to go there in the first place. You can't go there early, which is unfortunate. Maybe they'll fix that before the game goes live. And once you've been there once, then you can queue from anywhere, and then you can go about your business. You can even change classes. And unfortunately, you cannot queue for multiple classes at a time. You can only queue for one class. That's the class that you want to be in there for. And that's fine. I mean, it might be better and it might not be better for them to do it so that you could queue for multiple classes. Not really sure. It never took me very long to get into a dungeon, even when it was like 3 o'clock in the morning and I'm on a North American server and there shouldn't be anyone on. It still didn't take any more than maybe 10 minutes. And you can go mining, you can switch to your miner class, and you can go beat on rocks with a pickaxe for a while while you're waiting around. And then as soon as it comes back up, it'll say, you need to be on the class that you queued for in order to join. So you have to sort of switch over, and then you hit the join button, and it pops you right on into the dungeon. And then after you finish the dungeon, it brings you right to where you were standing when you finally got to join. So you don't miss any progress. You may as well be queued for something at all times. And then the actual system itself, finally, the combat system gets fun and interesting. You're trying to keep DOTs stacked, and in the case of Pugilist, which is the only class I have experience on, you because you have abilities that hit both for extra damage from behind and different abilities that hit for extra damage from the side, and that spell rotation thrown into it, so that, like I said earlier, I'm using my 1 ability, 2 ability, 3 ability, then 1 ability, 2 ability, and 4 ability. 3 and 4 have a different position that you have to stand on. So you can't just be like, okay, stay in behind, use an ability, stay in behind and use an ability, go to the flank and use an ability. You have to keep track of both at once. And it actually makes it feel really hectic to me. And when you're in a party, you have the addition of another mechanic called limit breaks. Those of you who are Final Fantasy aficionados will be familiar with the limit break system. In this case, as you kill things and use abilities with one another and do damage and take damage and heal and all the things that you do in a party, the limit break gauge goes up. And once it hits to maximum, you can use a big ability. And depending on which class uses the ability, it does a different thing. The only two that I'm familiar with are the Pugilist. It uses something called Braver, which does a big chunk of damage, and the Lancer, I believe, Gladiator. Gladiator uses, I think it's phalanx, and it's a big defense buff, so everybody survives better. And then this is even further complicated by the concept of having a dual limit break gauge during boss fights. So if you save up your full limit break gauge, then you get into a boss fight and you build up another limit break gauge, you get an even bigger one. And same concept, the only one I've ever seen used is Pugilist, because I always used them in fights, because it seemed to me that DPS is the most important thing for boss fights. You don't want to, wait around too long. And I don't know what the other ones do, but I'm sure that there is a strategy behind each one used. For example, like, there's one boss fight which the strategy was completely ignore all of the ads that come in and just focus down the boss, which is something I've never considered doing in an MMORPG boss fight before. Like, ignore the ads? Really? If they just run up and beat on your conjurer, it's okay. We'll just kill it before it's done. And that was a really tense boss fight. And boss fights are really fun. There's another one where there's sort of I'll just call it a button, because I don't really know how else to describe it, in the middle of the boss fight area. And you're fighting a giant ooze monster. And the ooze monster has seemingly infinite health. It's a really big amount of health. And you can sort of put dents in it, but it's like the idea of actually finishing the boss fight that way sounds like a poor choice. And so if you hit a button in the middle of the stage, a bomb will pop out. If you're familiar with bombs in Final Fantasy, they're these flame elemental things, and if you in most Final Fantasy games, if you deal enough damage to them, they will try and self-destruct. In this game, they just sort of try and self-destruct every once in a while. It's not related to the amount of damage that they take. And so what you want to do is you want to hit the button to summon a bomb. And then you summon sort of lure the bomb over to the ooze monster. And then when the bomb explodes, it'll deal damage to the ooze monster. And then the ooze monster will split into twice as many as were there before. And so you repeat the process until they're small enough that you can actually deal damage to and kill them. And by then there's a lot of them. It's sort of a hectic thing. Kind of scary sometimes. And so that's sort of a taste. Oh, I almost forgot one of the most important parts. There is a time limit for the dungeon. And if you run out of time, then you fail the dungeon and you get kicked out, which is not so bad a thing. It just means you miss out on the loot and the boss, and if you're still on the quest to finish that dungeon, you don't succeed the quest and you have to try again. But the concept that I'm picturing for later on will be dungeons that have sort of branching paths and different bosses in different areas. So imagine you only have so much time to get through the dungeon, and you really want to get the final boss because he's got the big loot table with all the best stuff. But you also have all these sort of optional bosses, and you're like, okay, if I plan this path, then I might get drops on Conjurer or whatever, and if I plan this path, then that fight's a little harder, but some of the drops are better, and we'll have a little bit less chance of getting through to the final boss. And you can sort of picture like puzzle dungeons on the same concept, where you have to figure out a maze, or you have to like pull levers to help your allies, and you have to coordinate things to get through in time. I just think that the concept of a timed dungeon opens up a lot of replayability for dungeons. Like, I've seen this boss, but I haven't seen these bosses, and I wonder what's over here. I haven't gone over there yet. And so that's one of the things I'm most excited about, is seeing some of the later dungeons that have the timed system. But that is enough about dungeons. Let me talk about the auction house. Most games, most MMORPGs nowadays have an auction house, and that's been something that's disappointed me about Final Fantasy XIV. Not a Realm Reborn, but just Final Fantasy XIV. It didn't have an auction house. It had this retainer system, and the retainer system was awful. I hated it. Mostly because you couldn't find the gear that you wanted. Later on, they initiated a system where you could search and you could find a piece of gear, but even the search functionality was pretty bad. And then it didn't just buy the gear for you. It would highlight the retainer inside of the retainer zone that was selling that piece of gear. And then you'd have to go to each one and figure out which price they were selling for and try not to get ripped off. It was the worst. In this new system, they've actually kept retainers, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. What they've done is, for selling, you use the retainers. You give your retainer items, and you tell them what price to sell it at. It's just like putting up an item on an auction house, except that there's this sort of immersion about giving an item to a person to sell instead of giving it to this nameless, faceless market counter. And I just really like the personality of that. And they can sort of initiate little restrictions based on this person can only carry so much stuff, so you can only put up 20 items at a time. It's just the restrictions that you had in other games make more sense in the context of actually giving it to a person to sell for you. And for buying, you just go to a market counter. I mean, it's a bulletin board basically, and so and then it just works just like an auction house. You do searches, you find what you want, and you buy it, and that's as simple as that. And I think that it's got not a whole lot of advantages over other systems, but at least they fixed it. At least it's as good as the other systems. And there are a lot of little ways that it feels better to me. I like the feel of it. That's enough about the marketplace. That's enough about the auction house, the market system. And I talked about that plenty. Anyway, next is the classes. I like the idea of multiple classes. Now, you don't have a class and a subclass like Final Fantasy XI was. What you do have, however, is a system in which you can change to a class at any time. You go and you do a basic quest, and then you have access to that class from then on. And the only thing you have to do to change classes is switch your equipment. It's based on your weapon. So if you're holding fist weapons, then you're a pugilist. If you're holding a sword in your hand, then you're a gladiator. And there are some advanced classes. Unfortunately, I didn't get access to any of them while I was playing the beta so far, so I don't know how they work. I mean, for example, there is Gladiator, in which you are holding a one-handed sword, but then there's Paladin, in which you are also holding a one-handed sword, and both of them use shields. So how does the system know whether you're a Paladin or gladiator? That's something I don't know yet. I assume it's just like after you unlock it, you can just, when you equip your sword, you then have to pick which one or something. Or it's possible that there are special offhanded shields for paladins that are different from the offhanded shields for gladiators. I'm not sure, but I'm sure that will become more clear later, and maybe I'll make another video about it once I learn it. I mentioned that the abilities weren't very interesting to me, and I think that the advanced classes might have the abilities that are interesting. For example, there's Pugilist, which is a hand-to-hand fighter, and then there's Monk. Maybe Monk has the abilities that move you around the opponent so that you're standing behind them or something like that. I'm not sure. I'm hoping. I got the hope. I think it would be really interesting if they released like a ninja class that unlocked when you were holding a dagger, and that it had like stealth abilities, and then you use the stealth abilities with the pugilist to do a bunch of backstab damage. I think that would be cool. And another interesting customization thing is that they have attributes. It's been so long since we've seen MMORPGs with spendable attribute points. You level up a couple of times and you get a point to spend on strength, dexterity, or whatever. And I really, really love that. It's separate for each class. So if you put a bunch of points into intelligence on Conjurer, you're not going to be screwed when you want to switch over to Lancer. And that's about the extent of the good for character customization. Visual customization is huge. I love visual customization. It's a thing, but that doesn't say much about gameplay. talents. This hurts me. There are no talents in Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn. No talent points whatsoever. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I think that the system that they're trying to put in place here is that you get the same sort of things that you would get in talents through your attributes and through the abilities that you choose to take from your various classes. And this sounds a little weak, I know, but when you think about it, the only things that you really gain from talent points are passive ability increases, which is covered in attributes, and your abilities work in a different way. They function differently. And you get that by bringing different abilities. It's not as good, I understand, but at least it's not horrible. And it's really strange. I love talent points. They're like my favorite thing in the world. The carrot they dangle in front of you, and I get to spend another talent point. That's great. And yet I didn't miss it while playing this game. I didn't think to myself, I wish I had a talent point to make something work differently. That's just something that never entered my mind. Maybe that's a testament to how well they built it, and maybe that's just a testament to how I didn't play it for long enough. I guess we'll find out later. But that's it for customization. Really, the only other thing I wanted to mention was that the game feels very good. There's something about it that just makes my heart kind of grow warm on the inside when I think about it. I'll close up with one final story. I was in a dungeon, which I found through the duty system, and we went and we made it to the final boss, and everybody was kind of confident at this point. We had all played very, very well. Everybody seemed to know the system, and we had a pretty good amount of time left. The last boss was a giant minotaur, and the longer the fight drags on, he starts tearing down walls and bringing in more and more adds. This was the fight I talked about earlier, where you want to just deal as much damage to him as humanly possible and ignore anything that comes in. Well, worst thing possible pretty much happened. He tore down the wall, and the adds went straight to aggro the healer, and the healer got dropped really fast. And so we wound up in a situation where we were basically, I was just beating on him, doing as much damage as I could, hoping that the tank could survive long enough, and the ranger was sort of doing damage from a distance and running around in a circle and trying to not get hit as much as possible. And the tank finally died. He's down to maybe 600 health. So I have my temporary abilities to increase my survivability by increasing my defense and my dodge rating. So I pop both of those, and every time I dodge, I get a chance to do, I can use an ability that slows the opponent. So I throw that one every time I can, so the slow is making it so that I'm taking a little less damage, and I come down and I have just a couple of hits left, and I notice that the limit break just came up. So I use my limit break. Everybody's dead except for me. I've got one hit left, and I barely kill the boss with the limit break. And I just feel fantastic. And that's where the strength is. So if you like dungeon play, you like playing with friends, you like barely saving a group of 3 other people, look into it, guys. Really, I recommend it to everyone, but especially if you love dungeons. I'll try and make more videos later, especially if this video becomes popular. So I'll see you next time.